Okay. Okay, great. Thank you, Brian. Okay, let's get started. Good morning. I'm Nestor Davidson, Chair of the New York City Rent Guidelines Board, and I'd like to welcome you to this meeting of the board. This is the second meeting in a series of public meetings and hearings to determine lease adjustments for rent-stabilized housing units in New York City with leases commencing on or being renewed on or after October 1st, 2023, and on or before September 30th, 2024. On behalf of the board, I would like to take this opportunity to welcome two new members of the board, Doug Apple and Genesis Aquino. I look forward to working with both of you, and I'll just say, going off script for a moment, that it's been really wonderful both to meet our new members and our returning members, and the tremendous expertise and experience and knowledge that everyone brings to the board. So it's really great to have you both, and welcome. I will now take a roll call. Please respond if you are present. Doug Apple? Here. Genesis Aquino? Christina DeRose, she is not present, but I understand she'll be joining us shortly. Robert Ehrlich? Present. Arpit Gupta, who is about to join us. Great. Alex Schwartz, not present. Christina Smith? Present. Adon Sultran? Present. Thank you. And Nestor Davidson, I'm present. Let the record show that we have a quorum. With the arrival of our two new members, I would be remiss if I didn't recognize the contributions of the two members who have left our board, Shayla Garcia and Christian Gonzalez Rivera. I would like to recognize their hard work and dedication to the Rent Guidelines Board. And on behalf of the current members, I would like to thank them and wish them well. I also want to take a moment to repeat something I said at the beginning of the meeting. We were having some technical difficulties on the recording. Hopefully we're capturing this now, but I just want to reiterate my recognition of David Reese, my predecessor, for his leadership and dedication to the RGB. I did so again at our first meeting, but wanted to make sure that was fully recorded. So again, on behalf of the entire board, I want to thank David again for all of his hard work and wish him well. The next planned meeting of this board will be here at the Landmarks Preservation Commission Conference Room on April 20th, starting at 9:30 a.m. Staff will present the 2023 Price Index of Operating Costs Report and the 2023 Mortgage Survey Report. The public can also live stream our meetings on YouTube at youtube.com/Rent Guidelines Board. Information regarding this meeting, thank you, is posted on our website, nyc.gov/RGB, in our meetings section. If you're interested in receiving emails updating you about our upcoming RGB meetings and hearings, please go to our homepage and click on the RGB email updates under quick links. At our meeting after that on April 27th, the board will hear testimony from members who have been invited by the tenant and owner members of the board. Speakers representing tenants will be heard from 9:45 a.m. to 12:15, and speakers representing owners will be heard from 1 p.m. until 3:30 p.m. To our members from our owner and tenant side, please get the list of presenters, anyone that you want to connect with us by Andrew by April 25th. The preliminary vote for rent-stabilized lease adjustments will be held on Tuesday, May 2nd. This in-person meeting will start at 7 p.m. and will be held in the Great Hall at Cooper Union, 7 East 7th Street at the corner of 3rd Avenue in Manhattan. This meeting also will be live streamed on our YouTube channel. We're going to hear today from Danielle Berger, presenting the 2023 Income and Affordability Study. A copy of the report is in everyone's folder. There are copies of the report for people who are here in person today, and we'll be posting it on our website after the meeting. Just click on Research on our homepage and download this and all of our other reports. And after Danielle's presentation, and some board discussion, we'll hear from our guest speaker, Michael Edelman, and I'll introduce Michael at the appropriate point. He's with M&T Realty Capital Corporation. And finally, as a friendly reminder to members, the annual filing of the Conflicts of Interest Board financial disclosure report. The filing period began on March 27th and will end on April 21st. Please file before the deadline. So before, Danielle, we introduce you and we hear the report, at our last meeting, Shayla raised the question of our hearings schedule. And so I said we would take that up at the beginning at our next meeting. So I'd love to get folks' view. I'll just share where I am on that. For nearly a decade now, we've had 4 meetings. We have traditionally been to the boroughs and Manhattan. During the pandemic, obviously, we had our meetings online. Last year, we had 2 meetings in person and 2 meetings online. I do think it makes sense to go back in the balance more towards in-person. I do think for me, and part of this is some of the work I've done in other parts of my life, I think there are equity reasons for retaining some option, at least one option for folks who can't come in person to our meetings. I'd love to hear folks' thoughts on that, but where that leads for me, and I'm really inviting reflection and conversation, is that I think if we do 3 in-person meetings and then 1 online, and I think in talking to Andrew and the staff, I think we can work on, although you're still looking at venues, but I think we can work on the geography of where we meet to make sure that the core of where our tenants live, we can be accessible to them. So I would, I guess my initial instinct is to have a meeting in Brooklyn, to have a meeting in Queens, and to have a meeting in the Bronx, very southern Bronx, close to northern Manhattan, and then to preserve 1 online meeting so that folks who cannot make it on a work night, on a school night, in person can join us as well. So that's my initial thoughts, but I said we'd open this up for conversation. I'd love to hear what everyone thinks.
Sure.
Thank you.
Some initial thoughts. I actually respectfully disagree in as much as I think there's value to having in-person hearings, and I think that while I understand the reasons that you're expressing in terms of, I don't want to say convenience, but just the realities of scheduling and things like that, one of these boroughs is going to wind up being shortchanged, in my opinion. I think we've seen historically in some years past, it's even difficult to make sure that everybody is dialed in and locked in and paying the due respect sometimes that the tenants and the testimony deserves. And I think if you're adding, or if you're making one of the 4 virtual, you're going to see perhaps a continuation of that trend, and that's a concern of mine. If you wanted to make an additional hearing, so you would have 4 in person and then have a virtual, I think that would be fine. That could be considered by, I'm sure, some as overkill, but that's my position on it.
Thoughts from, thank you, Adon, I appreciate that. Other thoughts?
I have no issue with the suggestion.
Okay.
I think it's more than reasonable. I mean, 3 in person is in those 3 boroughs definitely works, and doing 1 virtual.
Okay. Great. Other thoughts? Well, let's keep discussing and try and resolve this soon. I know obviously there are a lot of logistics involved, and we want to give people. I mean, would be in June, so we have a little bit of lead time. But it'd be nice to resolve this soon. Doug, any questions or thoughts?
I just more in form of a question.
Please.
What kind of I guess this is probably when pre-COVID. What was the sort of? You may not have taken attendance, Andrew, but what kind of turnouts would you get across the different boroughs? I went to try to watch some of the hearings, but you can't really tell. Like, do you have any sense?
Yeah, you can't tell by watching because you don't show.
Yeah,
you don't see
all you
audience.
see is the folks standing up there getting yelled at. Yeah.
So, each hearing had, they were well attended, some more than others. So, we generally have a 3-hour span, but we keep it open till everyone who signs up speaks to be heard. So, some of them run to that end time. It's either 3 or 4 hours. And then some will go over. So they all last to the end time. So I can't say to other boards, but I think they're relatively well attended. I mean, we do get probably 300 people testify over all the hearings. something like that. We track it, but I haven't looked for it in 4 years. But I want to say it's roughly 300 people show up over the course.
That's impressive, and it's important. Okay, good. Well, let's keep discussing. Sorry, Christina, anything else? No, that's it. Okay, great. Well, thank you all, and we'll keep talking and thinking about the logistics and come back and try and bring some closure to this. Terrific. So with that, and obviously we'll talk to Christina and we can keep discussing. With that, I will now introduce Danielle Berger, who will be presenting the 2023 Income and Affordability Study. I'm also excited to announce that Danielle was recently promoted to co-research director, a well-deserved recognition of her continued hard work on behalf of the board. Congratulations. And Danielle, as this is getting warmed up, I will say again what we said last week, which is we'll have plenty of time for questions and comments afterwards, but I'll say to especially our 2 new board members, if folks have points of clarification, Danielle, I think it's okay to ask you as we go? Yeah, sure. Terrific.
That's a little hot.
It still says perfecting the image. It was fine before. I
Done?
don't know if I should turn it off.
Did you sound ready? Okay, great.
Okay.
Got email yesterday.
Okay, thank you for your patience. Good morning. The Income and Affordability Study is researched and presented The Income and Affordability Study is researched and presented each year in accordance with Section 26-510B of the Rent Stabilization Law, which requires the Rent Guidelines Board to consider relevant data from the current and projected cost of living indices and permits consideration of other measures of housing affordability in its deliberations. To assist the board in meeting this obligation, RGB research staff produce an annual Income and Affordability Study, which reports on housing affordability and tenant income in New York City's rental market. The study highlights year-to-year changes in many of the major economic factors affecting New York City's tenant population and takes into consideration a broad range of market forces, rent levels, and public policies affecting housing affordability. Such factors include New York City's overall economic condition, including unemployment rates and inflation rates, as well as household income and housing costs, and other relevant factors such as the number of eviction proceedings and homelessness levels. In summary, 2022 saw New York City with growth in gross city product, which in inflation-adjusted or real terms is forecasted to increase 3.3% during calendar year 2022. The unemployment rate fell to 5.7%, down 4.3 percentage points. The city also gained an average of 297,592 jobs, a 7.0% increase. Inflation rose at a faster pace than the previous year, with prices rising 6.1% on average during 2022 in the metro area. Average inflation-adjusted wages decreased 2.1% over the prior 12 months, while real total wages rose by 4.9%. The number of cash assistance recipients increased by 14.2%, and the number of food stamp recipients, now known as SNAP, increased by 1.3%. As of March 29, 2023, the New York State Emergency Rental Assistance Program has made 175,301 payments on behalf of tenants for rent assistance within New York City. The average payment amount is $13,410. Homeless staying in Department of Homeless Services shelters increased, rising by 8.0%. In housing court, following the end of the eviction moratorium, non-payment cases rose 167.8%, and non-payment calendared cases rose 228.6%. Evictions also increased from 136 to 4,109. And data from the 2021 New York City Housing and Vacancy Survey shows that rent-stabilized tenants, excluding those receiving rental assistance, had a median gross rent-to-income ratio of 32.2%. For all rent-stabilized tenants, the median household income is $47,000, median contract rent is $1,400, and median gross rent is $1,547. The vacancy rate for rent-stabilized rental units was 4.57%. As this graph illustrates, 2022 saw falling unemployment rates for both New York City and the nation as a whole. The New York City rate is in purple and was 5.7% in 2022, a decrease of 4.3 percentage points, and roughly equal to the unemployment rate in 2015. The U.S. jobless rate is in green and was 3.6% in 2022. As this graph shows, New York City gained jobs in 2022. There was an increase of 297,592 jobs in 2022, a 7.0% increase from 2021 total job levels. However, average employment in 2022 is down 2.1% as compared to 2019 levels. The rate of inflation, as measured by the Consumer Price Index, which measures the change in the cost of typical household goods, rose at a faster pace during 2022, increasing by 6.1% in the New York City metro area. Note that the CPI is not exclusive to New York City, as the study area extends into the suburbs of New York City. This was the largest increase since 1981 in the New York City metro area, and follows increases over the past 3 years of 3.3% in 2021 and 1.7% in both 2019 and 2020. For comparison, the U.S. CPI for urban consumers increased 8.0% in 2022, 3.3 percentage points higher than the previous year. The Consumer Price Index can be disaggregated to see the rate of change in rent. As the graph shows, the percentage change in rent for the New York City metro area, in purple, has increased at a slower rate than the U.S. as a whole, in green, for the past 9 years. In 2022, rents in the metro area rose 2.5% and rose by 6.0% in the U.S. As reported by the Quarterly Census of Employment and Wages, and as this graph shows, while nominal wages rose, inflation-adjusted wages fell in the most recent 12-month period, which runs from the fourth quarter of 2021 through the third quarter of 2022. Real wages are shown here in 2022 dollars and decreased 2.1%, while nominal wages increased 3.6%. Note that the average wage, which is what is illustrated in this graph, is the amount of total wages paid in New York City divided by the total employment in New York City. In the most recent time period, total wages increased nominally by 10.9%, a larger proportional change than the change in employment of 7.1%. When total wages rise faster than employment, average wages rise. We now move on to cash assistance recipients. The purple portion of the graph shows the number of recipients in the Family Assistance Program. The darker green shows the number of recipients in the Safety Net Assistance Program. The light green bars represent the number of recipients who have converted from the Family Assistance Program to the Safety Net Assistance Program. In 2022, total cash assistance cases rose by 14.2%. Other indicators of public assistance, which are not shown here, include SNAP recipients, which increased by 1.3% in 2022, and Medicaid enrollees, which fell by 4.9%. The New York State Emergency Rental Assistance Program, authorized in 2021, has allocated $3.3 billion towards helping eligible New Yorkers pay rent and utility arrears. Applications for this program closed in January 2023, but payments are ongoing. For renters who qualified, the program provided for up to 12 months of rent or utility arrears and up to 3 months of prospective rent. Assistance is generally paid directly to the landlord and/or utility, and by accepting payment for rent arrears, the recipient landlord agrees to waive any late fees on rent arrears, keep rent constant for 1 year, and in most circumstances, not seek to evict tenants for 1 year after the first payment is received. This program has been accepting applications since June of 2021, and of all the applications for rent arrears in New York State through March 2023, 73.4% of all applications, or 296,863, came from residents of New York City. As of March 2023, 175,301 payments were issued on behalf of New York City tenants for rental assistance, 75.5% of the total payments within New York State. Payments for rent arrears in New York City totaled $1.8 billion, with another $561 million expended for prospective rent payments, for a total of $2.35 billion, or 81.4% of the total value of payments within New York State. Note that there are remaining program funds not yet distributed that are earmarked towards applications that have been provisionally approved but are pending due to landlord verification. As of March 2023, there are 11,905 such applications within New York State, totaling payments of $148 million. This map shows the total number of payments and the average payment amount by borough as of March 29, 2023. Almost 3/4 of payments within New York City included both rent arrears and prospective rent. The average payment for both rent arrears and prospective rent was $13,410 in New York City, compared to $9,397 in the balance of the state. As illustrated in the map on this slide, average payments were lowest in the Bronx, $11,439, and highest in Queens, $15,407. This chart shows sheltered homelessness levels for those in DHS facilities during calendar years 1992 through 2022. As you can see, levels increased in 2022 by 8.0%. While levels fell in the first half of 2022, they rose in the second half, which the Department of Homeless Services has attributed in part to the influx, quote, influx of asylum seekers from the southern United States border to New York City. Moving on to Housing Court, this chart shows the number of non-payment filings, the number of calendared cases related to non-payment, and the number of evictions, both for non-payment and holdover cases. Following the end of the eviction moratorium, the number of non-payment cases increased 167.8% in 2022, while non-payment cases actually heard increased 228.6%. The number of residential evictions rose from 136 to 4,109. Preliminary results from the 2021 HVS were released last spring. This approximately triennial survey provides details on the housing and demographic characteristics of New York City residents, including affordability of housing, rents, incomes, and vacancy rates for both renter and owner-occupied housing. It is also the only survey that is able to provide data specifically for rent-stabilized tenants. Examining affordability of rental housing, the 2021 HVS reported that the median gross rent-to-income ratio was 34.3%, meaning that half of all households residing in rental housing pay more than 34.3% of their income in gross rent, and half pay less. The median gross rent-to-income ratio of rent-stabilized households is 36.2%. However, it is important to note that officially reported rent-to-income ratios are affected by an anomaly in the way that rents for tenants receiving Section 8 and other rental assistance programs are recorded by the HVS. While generally paying no more than 30% of their income towards rent, tens of thousands of rent-stabilized tenants receiving rental assistance are recorded with gross rent-to-income ratios in excess of 100%. Excluding those tenants who received vouchers or other rental assistance, the median gross rent-to-income ratio for rent-stabilized tenants falls to 32.2%, 4 percentage points lower than the ratio for all rent-stabilized tenants. The ratio is 32.9% for those in non-regulated rentals, 30.3% for tenants in public housing, and 42.8% for those in rent-controlled or other regulated units. A household is considered severely rent-burdened if they pay more than 50% of household income towards rent. In 2022, more than one-third of rental households, 36.6%, paid more than 50% of their household income in gross rent. For rent-stabilized tenants, 39.5% pay more than 50% of their household income in gross rent, including 40.3% of tenants in buildings built prior to 1974, and 35.1% of tenants in buildings built in 1974 or later. Note that this proportion includes those households that do receive rental assistance, somewhat inflating this figure. According to the 2021 HVS, which reflects household income for 2020, the median income for all households stood at $60,550 in 2020. The median income for rental households was $50,000. Owner-occupied households maintained substantially higher incomes, which in 2020 stood at $98,000, almost double the average income of renters. The 2021 HVS found different income levels among those living in different types of apartments. Rent-stabilized tenants had a median household income of $47,000 in 2020. Tenants living in non-regulated units had a higher household income than rent-stabilized tenants, a median of $62,960 in 2020. Tenants living in public housing had a median income level of $18,530, and tenants living in rent-controlled or other regulated units had a median of $24,000 in 2020. Looking at rent levels in 2021, the median monthly contract rent, which does not include fuel and utilities, for all rental units was $1,500. Rent-stabilized tenants paid less than the typical rental tenant, with a median contract rent of $1,400, including a median of $1,400 for tenants in buildings built prior to 1974, and $1,906 for tenants in buildings built in 1974 or later. While tenants living in private, non-regulated rentals paid $1,825, tenants in public housing had the lowest median contract rent, $500, and those in rent-controlled or other regulated units had a median of $1,100. For median monthly gross rent, which includes fuel and utilities, for all rental units, the median was $1,650 a month. Rent-stabilized tenants paid less than the typical rental tenant, with a median gross rent of $1,547, including a median of $1,500 for tenants in buildings built prior to 1974 and $2,109 for tenants in buildings built in 1974 or later. While tenants living in private, non-regulated rentals paid $1,950, tenants in public housing had the lowest median gross rent, $510, and those in rent-controlled or other regulated units had a median of $1,187. This chart illustrates the distribution of rent-stabilized housing by contract rent level. The 2021 found that 17% of rent-stabilized units had a contract rent of less than $900 per month, as compared to 10% of unregulated units. 36% rented for between $900 and $1,499, as compared to 21% of unregulated units. 32% rented for between $1,500 and $2,299, as compared to 39% of unregulated units, and 15% rented for $2,300 or more, as compared to 30% of unregulated units. Not illustrated here, while just 9.7% of rent-stabilized units in buildings built prior to 1974 had a contract rent of $2,300 or more, 42.8% of those in buildings built in 1974 or later had contract rents of $2,300 or more. The 2021 HVS found that the citywide vacancy rate was 4.54% in 2021, below the 5% threshold required for rent regulation to continue under state law. The Bronx had the lowest vacancy rate in the city at 0.78%. Manhattan, by contrast, had the highest vacancy rate in 2021 at 10.01%. Of the remaining boroughs, Brooklyn's rate stood at 2.73%, and Queens and Staten Island, in conjunction, had a vacancy rate of 4.15%. Vacancy rates are also provided for certain types of rental housing. Rent-stabilized units had a vacancy rate of 4.57%, virtually equal to the rate for all rental apartments, while those rent-stabilized units in buildings built before 1974 had a vacancy rate of 3.22%. Private, non-regulated units had a vacancy rate of 5.29%, and public housing or other regulated rentals had a vacancy rate of 1.36%. The HVS found vacancy rates varying significantly among different asking rents. As might be expected, apartments renting for the least had the lowest vacancy rates, while more expensive units had substantially higher vacancy rates. Apartments with an asking rent of less than $900 per month had a vacancy rate of just 0.86%, while those renting for at least $2,300 per month had a vacancy rate of 12.64%. Another source of rent and income information is the annual American Community Survey conducted by the Census Bureau. The most recent data from this survey is from 2021. Note that ACS data from 2020 is not able to be compared to data from other years. Unlike the HVS, which is able to be stratified for rent-stabilized tenants, the ACS provides data for all renters in New York City, regardless of regulation status. Looking at median gross rent-to-income ratios from this survey from 2008 through 2021, the rates have ranged from a low of 30.1% in 2019 to a high of 32.7% in 2014. The ratio was 32.2% in 2021, a 2.1 percentage point increase from 2019. The American Community Survey also reports on the proportion of households who are considered rent-burdened and severely rent-burdened. That is, households paying at least 30% or 50% of their income towards gross rent, respectively. The totality of each column represents the number of households paying at least 30% of their income towards gross rent. Looking at these ratios from 2008 through 2021, the proportion of households paying at least 30% of their income towards rent has ranged from a low of 50.1% in both 2008 and 2019 to a high of 55.1% in 2014. The ratio was 54.1% in 2021, a 4.0 percentage point increase from 2019. Looking at monthly contract and gross rent from 2008 through 2021 in real 2021 dollars shows that from 2008 to 2021, rent has increased in inflation-adjusted terms by approximately $300 a month for both contract and gross rent. In 2021, the latest available data, median contract rent was $1,490, an inflation-adjusted increase of 2.4% from 2019, and median gross rent was $1,602, an inflation-adjusted increase of 2.8% from 2019. The American Community Survey also reports on renter housing costs as a percentage of income for different income brackets. As household income increases, so does housing affordability. In 2021, 89.9% of households making less than $20,000 a year had a rent-to-income ratio in excess of 30%. But for those households making at least $75,000 a year, the ratio who spend at least 30% of income on rent drops to 16.0%. This graph illustrates the poverty rate for New York City individuals and New York City renter-occupied family households per the American Community Survey. As the purple bars on this graph show, the poverty rate for individuals in New York City in 2021 rose over 2019 by 2 percentage points and was 18.0% compared to 12.8% for the United States as a whole, which is not shown on this graph. This graph also shows the poverty rate for renter-occupied family households, shown in green. The rate also rose from 2019 levels by 2.5 percentage points and was 20.3% in 2021, compared to 5.6% for owner-occupied households, also not shown on this graph. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the U.S. Census Bureau launched a new survey initiative, the Household Pulse Survey. The first survey, called Week 1, was conducted at the end of April 2020. The survey data was collected on a weekly basis through July 2020, and then every 2 weeks through October 2021. The survey resumed in December 2021, transitioning to collecting data during a single 2-week period out of every 4 weeks. Despite changing the collection periods, the survey continues to call them weeks to maintain continuity. The HPS surveys conducted since the last INA was published are weeks 44 through 55, which is April 2022 through March of 2023. In addition to data for the U.S. as a whole, data is also available from 15 metro areas, including the New York City metro area, which extends into the suburbs of New York City, a population of approximately 20 million persons. Among the questions asked of respondents regarding housing is whether they are caught up on rent or mortgage. The average proportion of adults residing in households in the New York City metro area who reported they are not current on their rent in the history of this survey from April of 2020 through March of 2023 was 22.7%, including 32.7% of households, of adults in households with a household income of less than $35,000, and 7.0% of households, of adults in households with a household income of $100,000 or more. The average proportion of adults residing in households in the New York City metro area who reported they are not current on their rent in weeks 44 through 55, the survey since the last INA was published, was 21.5%. Of those not caught up in rent in weeks 44 through 55, which again is April 2022 through March of 2023, 23.6% reported that they were 0 months behind. 18.2% were 1 month behind, and 18.1% were 2 months behind. 32.9% were between 3 and 7 months behind. 11.3% were 8 or more months behind. For those who reported being behind at least 1 month, the average was 3.53 months. Respondents were also asked if they had applied for the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. Between weeks 34 and 55, which is July 2021 through March 2023, 16.5% of households in the New York City metro area reported they had applied for ERAP, including 26.8% of households with a household income of less than $35,000 and 1.9% of households with a household income of $100,000 or more. The housing questions in the HPS also include the current rent for respondents. The median current rent in the New York City area between weeks 46 and 55 which is June 2022 through March 2023, was $1,690 per month, including a median of $1,200 in households with a household income of less than $35,000 and $2,600 in households with a household income of $100,000 or more. Respondents are also asked if their rent has changed in the last 12 months. Between weeks 46 and 55, 43.1% of households had either no change in rent or a decrease in rent. 26.3% had rent increase by less than $100. 17.7% had rent increase between $100 and $249 per month, and 12.9% of households reported that their rent had increased by $250 or more in the past 12 months. As this graph illustrates, of the 15 metro areas delineated in the HPS, the New York City metro area has the highest average proportion of adults in households that report being behind on rents in weeks 44 through 55. The smallest ratio was Phoenix, with 10.4% of adults in households reporting being behind on rent. An average of 13.9% of adults in renter households in the nation as a whole reported not being caught up in rent, 7.5 percentage points lower than renters in the New York City metro area. In weeks 46, in June of 2022, the HPS began asking respondents for their current rent. In the 10 surveys thus far that have asked this question, the median rent in the New York City metro area was $1,690 per month. This compares to the median in the U.S. as a whole of $1,200 in this time period. As this graph illustrates, while the median rent in the New York City metro area is higher than 9 other metro areas, it is less than that in 5 others, including the most expensive area, San Francisco, where median rents were $2,200 a month. This table summarizes some of the key indicators that we have discussed during this presentation, with the change in each quarter and annually as compared to the same time period in 2021. A more detailed version of this table can be found in Appendices 1 and 2 of the report. In summary, for 2021 on an annual basis, the unemployment rate fell to 5.7%, down 4.3 percentage points. The city also gained an average of 297,592 jobs, a 7.0% increase. New York City also saw growth in gross city product, which in inflation-adjusted or real terms is forecasted to increase 3.3% during calendar year 2022. Homeless staying in city shelters increased, rising by 8.0%, due in part to an influx of asylum seekers, while the number of cash assistance recipients also increased by 14.2%. And the number of food stamp recipients, now known as SNAP, increased by 1.3%. But the number of Medicaid enrollees fell, down 4.9%. And in housing court, following the end of the eviction moratorium, non-payment cases rose 167.8% in 2022, and non-payment calendared cases rose by 228.6%. And with high inflation in place, average inflation-adjusted wages decreased by 2.1% over the prior 12 months. Thank you, and if there's any questions.
Thank you so much, Danielle, and I'm sure we will have a number of questions. I'll just offer one reflection, as I did last week with Brian's presentation. First of all, thank you. This is a tremendous range of information that you've collected for us. I'll just reflect on the challenge we all face as a board. These data reflect different time periods. Many of them reflect information that we are getting from 2020, 2021, and comparative. And we'll just have a challenge, I think, as we work together and think through these data for how we take into account the pandemic and the continuing effects of the pandemic. The data give some indication of that, but I think it's important to remember as we think about the timeframes. I have some questions, but let me begin by opening it up and seeing if our members have questions.
I've
Adon, please.
I have some comments and then a bunch of questions, but I will just state my comments first. So I guess I'm a little bit concerned, and I've mentioned this again before, but I think it's really important how the data that we're receiving is presented and what is actually being selected to be presented to the board. And I say that because language, as we all know, matters. And for example, right, I genuinely do appreciate the hard work that the RGB does to collect this data and to compile it and to make these presentations. But for example, right, if we're talking about ERAP, we should be also talking about LRAP, right? Landlord, payments directly to landlords for a separate program. If we're talking about ERAP and LRAP, we should also be talking about the PPP program, right? Like, additionally, there's still no cost of living analysis for a tenant's perspective. And these metrics exist, like these studies exist. The Fund of the City of New York does something like that. You know, CSS has data, and again, I understand what the opposing side is gonna say about this in terms of CSS, for example, right? Like the perspective from which we're providing some of the data or the arguments about these things, but still, like, nowhere, I've never seen the RGB as a body dedicate today's hearing topic to trying to simulate what a rent-stabilized tenant actually has to deal with in terms of their cost of living in New York with constant increases that have been coming for the last 50 years. And so I want to pose, I guess, an initial question. Why is it that we haven't taken up that charge, right? Like, why haven't we dedicated resources to try and replicate that when that means everything in this analysis? If we're going to follow the law, which the law was created, this entire body was created to preserve affordability, to fight against price gouging and unjust and unconscionable adjustments, right? Because again, increase is not ever used. Increase and profit are not used in the actual law. We're not making choices on rent increases, rent adjustments. And so why is it, if we're supposed to be preventing rent price gouging, if we're trying to preserve affordability, if we're trying to maintain stability in neighborhoods, because it also says in the law, we're trying not to uproot long-standing neighborhoods and tenants, why are we not trying to simulate that?
Do you want to just say a word about sort of data in that regard? You have a more of a historical perspective. And the other thing I will say is we have obviously the ability as a board to add data as we move forward. So we'd love to hear more on that.
There may be certain things that are not perhaps in the report. I mean, we do try to make an attempt to, particularly with income to rent ratios for tenants, about affordability issues. We try to get to wage data for folks that are in certain sectors. We try to look at the ability or the troubles they are issued, that they're filing, trying to pay their rent. You know, there's certainly other things that we can include. I don't know if there's, I don't think we've attempted to try to make a metric and maybe I'm not totally understanding what you're asking, but a metric to say that these are additional expenses that we're not looking at that rent-stabilized tenants are facing.
I think it's more about understanding the data that you're trying to produce and painting a clear picture of that data. Because, for example, and if you'll just bear with me for 1 second, I know I have a lot of papers with me today, right? But I find it kind of remarkable that, again, the Fund for the City of New York has a self-sufficiency standard for New York City, where they're talking about all of the costs and expenses that a tenant living in New York, not broken down by rent stabilized, right, but just generally in New York, their costs. And so you can literally put in the number of adults, the number of infants, preschoolers, school-age children, teenagers. You can select what borough, northern Manhattan, separate from southern Manhattan, downtown Brooklyn, separate from rest of Brooklyn, Bronx, et cetera, and it will break down for you monthly costs in northern Manhattan. So for somebody in Harlem with 1 adult, 1 preschooler, and a teenager, housing at $1,400, childcare $1,285, food $1,259, healthcare $577, transportation $127, taxes, etc. And in the example I just gave you, that number comes out to about $72,000, right? In terms of yearly cost for a family of 3 with 1 adult. So again, I'm not saying that people need to take that for, 100% fact. Obviously, on the other side, there's going to be arguments and ways to discredit that. My point is, how is it that this has happened for 50 years and we have nothing simulating this? I feel like that is a travesty. And we're going to try to see if we can get folks to come in and speak to this, but I think that it would be more appropriate for the board as a body to be delving into these things from the jump. It shouldn't be necessitated on us as the tenant representatives and the community that we represent behind us and the advocates who are tirelessly working at this to have to produce this stuff.
List that you just went through, you're talking about household expenses and groceries, transportation, healthcare. This board is about rent, so it is one of many expenses. And we're here talking about, last week we talked about income and expense. The data is directed towards rent expenses. And so landlords can't possibly be responsible for needing to encompass all household income and expenses.
Respectfully, on the other side of the aisle, when we're talking about all of the expenses that you guys are, or that landlords are incurring, right, we're talking about a very large picture of certain things that you're bringing into the equation. And I don't think it is inappropriate, and I actually think it is appropriate, again, if we're going to be following the letter of the law, we're supposed to be making these decisions to preserve affordability and prevent unconscionable rent hikes, right, increases, that we understand what's happening. How is it that we are trying to separate this in an almost purely academic way, and we're not trying to delve into what an actual person who is going to be affected by this decision would look like? If you're telling me to not count in food, the cost of internet, which I also think is a utility, and I have a question as to why it is that we don't include internet costs in 2023 as a component to this. I think that's a legitimate concern. But these are the things that we're talking about in terms of how somebody can stay in their home, right? If you can't pay these things, you are going to get sued and you are going to get evicted. That is how New York works and the eviction mill that happens in housing courts. So what I'm saying is that,
Yeah,
would you like to?
yeah,
Well, no, eviction mill.
yeah.
Yeah,
So there's.
Wait,
yeah.
Don.
yeah,
In New York City,
yep.
all right, ERAP's made payments, you're towards rent from the pandemic. You have large balances that are owed. But to get evicted in New York City, with all the programs that are out there, you have to want to get evicted. You have to not to have taken advantage of whatever's out there. Listen, when the pandemic kicked in 2020, I was on the phone with clients of mine where the government was giving out subsidies and whatnot, giving handouts, whatever it was, and at the same time telling tenants, do not pay your rent. But they also didn't tell owners, don't pay your mortgage, don't pay your fuel, don't pay your real estate taxes, don't pay all that stuff. So remember, it goes both ways.
I think, to Adan's point, and you, Christina, the CPI did, landlords were also affected by the CPI, but at the same time, the tenants are the ones who have to pay for, electricity, gas, and other costs, right, of living, of maintaining their apartments. That cost doesn't go to tenants. Also, I think the bigger picture is really thinking about people's income. Like if you make $47,000 a year, right? You make $47,000 a year, you bring home, if you check, you after taxes, you bring home $507. What I'm trying to say is that with that income, whether you got ERAP or not, you are still going to fall behind in rent. So ERAP just helped you pay what you couldn't pay because you were unemployed. And even one-shot deal, in order to qualify for that, you need to make enough income to continue paying your ongoing rent. But if your income is not enough to handle the increases the increases that go every year, then you are going to fall behind. Even if you have a lawyer in housing court, the lawyer is only going to slow down the eviction, but you're going to get a bit anyways. And that's why we have seen a hike in eviction in the city, because even though people got money to pay the rent, which went directly to the landlords, not to tenants, people are still facing eviction. And it's because people can't afford the rent. I mean, it's very clear. $47,000 in New York City, you are going to end up in a homeless shelter. And that's more than 50% of people making that money.
So Christina had a comment, and then Doug. Thank you.
It's actually more of a question for Don, because I'm trying to understand your query about the data. So the data that you're talking about with like true cost of living or these statistics, how is that different? How does that differ from when we talk about CPI or wages, or how does what we're talking about, how is that not encompassed in what you're bringing to the table? Because I'd like to understand that, because I don't think I understand that well.
Sure. I think the point that I'm making about it is that, and this goes back to part of my initial point in terms of the way the data winds up getting presented, and then we have to kind of decipher and then argue to explain, these discrepancies in like total wages going up, right? Or employment in certain sector going up, as if these are positive things that are listed in the overview, as though they are like affecting the tenants that we're talking about in a way that actually makes a difference to them, right? So if we're talking about increase in wages, it says also in the report further in, but not in the overview.
Real wages fell.
Real wages, right. But we're talking about like in higher paying sectors. We're talking about employment going up. It is true that in service sectors and leisure, service and leisure, whatever I forget the exact term apart, but service jobs, yes, that is an increase. How are we accounting for the fact that most of the people that we're talking about that make $47,000 in median income are working multiple jobs? We don't have data, but I can guarantee you that many of these folks who are still in their homes, who have not yet been evicted, who have these median incomes, they're working multiple jobs. That can certainly account for that increase. So I understand what you're saying in terms of how CPI, and to be fair, what I will say is that it does show that CPI did increase, and that's part of what we're arguing, but I think you can't just look at it as a number without understanding all of the things that come with it, because we're talking about people's lives. We're talking about a decision that we make, a 3.25% increase and then a 5% increase puts people out of homes. And just very quickly, I just want to, respond to some of what Rob, what you were saying. So I'm glad you brought up ERAP. You called it a handout. I would push you to think about maybe it was a bailout, but regardless of
Actually,
that,
I didn't call that the handout. I called what the government gave out at the beginning of the pandemic, the $2,000 here or the $1,000 here, if you qualified. That was the handout.
Okay, fair enough, Rob. If you want to talk about that $2,000 handout or a $2.4 billion payment in total to landlords, not even including the LRAP program, which is another $287 million that went to landlords.
Which is generally for the people who did vacate and left with money owed.
Which we talked about last session. What area had the highest percentage of folks vacating during the pandemic? Lower Manhattan. Who resides in Lower Manhattan? What are the incomes that look like? You're looking at people who are more affluent who wind up within these mixed rate buildings, right, that we were talking about last week. Those are the folks who are leaving, Rob. We're not talking about people in the Bronx who have lower incomes. If you look at the vacancy numbers, which they just put up before, it was at 0%, close to 0%.
Then I don't know why you bring up the LRAP then, if that's what your
My
point
point
is.
is that if we're talking about money that winds up getting paid out to make folks whole, landlords, you need to speak about this globally. You need to speak about it in holistic terms. You can't just not include that. That's $287 million. Is there any other payout in the history, in nationally, that's been paid out of that kind of large amount to landlords, ever? And I don't think so. 2.4 billion and then another 287. And
You mean for rent arrears that were rightfully owed?
that's arguable. Rob.
Rightfully owed. How is it arguable?
Yeah, how is that even remotely arguable?
We know, but it's fine.
No. Adon,
Yeah.
Christina asked a question about how your data source differs from our data source, but you didn't answer, and now you're saying arguable arrears. How is the money that EREP paid towards arguable?
My point was about the actual arrears what's allegedly being owed, that's why we are in housing court most days, right?
How?
Because we don't always agree on what is owed.
Well,
That was my point.
But we always have a solution for that, right? The tenant comes and gives their rent receipts, and then I look at them against what was charged. No, we can't do what you're doing. We
Okay.
can't do that, because you're saying that somehow did landlords fabricate rent ledgers?
I'm not trying to get into that.
No, but it's so important, because you're basically saying that ERAP was somehow an excessive amount that landlords were paid. But all those people who got ERAP were why there were 136 evictions during the pandemic. And as to your eviction mill, I just want to say, we have 8.4 million people in New York City. There were 4,000 evictions. That's 0.04% of the population. There's also a very popular trend with the word eviction. It's all over Twitter. All of the DSA people love to say there were eviction filings. These are not eviction filings. They're non-payment proceedings because there is rent due. So there is inflammatory language about the word eviction. There were 4,000 families evicted. That's too many. I agree. But in the grand scheme of the numbers, it's 0.04% of the New York City population. And it's 4,000 too many. But we have to keep it in perspective.
I wonder if we can find data of how many, because most tenants who live in rent-stabilized apartments are low income.
Yes.
So I wonder if we can get data about how many of those rent-stabilized tenants were evicted out of those 4,000 people, or had eviction filings,
It's-
whether for non-payment or holdover.
Yeah, Danielle, and
The-
then let's hear from Doug. Thanks.
The eviction numbers, there's an analysis of that in the report.
You said there is?
It's in the report
What
for the
what page is that in,
evictions.
Danielle? Thanks.
Is it specific to rent-stabilized tenants?
Yes.
Also, to talk about, back to the ERAP conversation, whether it was just, let's say ERAP payments were just, I think that also proves the point that most landlords had no loss because their money were paid back,
It's,
So let's get the answer, Akina, and
Yes.
then let's ask from.
it is at the second column of page 24, the last paragraph. I don't have it for the number of filings, just for the actual number of evictions. And I should say, it's not, I can't say that the tenant was rent stabilized. I can say that the eviction was in a building that contains rent stabilized units.
Got it.
Great,
Okay.
thank you. And Doug? And then we'll come back.
No
I just want to
problem.
make sure that others.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
I think it's Danielle, your question. The data from the HVS survey, I guess the weekly surveys, that 21% that shows as behind in rent, is there any other source data other than that sort of survey? Historically data, recent data on, because I think that is one of the issues that we're all wrestling with is that.
I'm not aware of any other sources for that data. There could be certain advocacy organizations or community organizations that are surveying people on a much smaller scale about that. Sorry, my mic wasn't
How
on.
big were those weekly surveys? Like for New York City, do we know how many people were surveyed?
Like
trying
the
to get a sense
actual
of-
number, I mean, it's a
Get a sense
survey.
of the validity of the survey data itself.
Yeah, so I spent a long time this year going through the survey and trying to focus in on only giving statistics that I thought would have statistical significance.
Right.
And that's why, for instance, I'm not giving you just one particular survey. I'm giving you 12 surveys or 20 surveys.
Right.
Or because I wanted it to be significant, the actual sample size of renters in the New York metro area is like 600 people. So you can't break it down too much because then you're losing all the significance.
Right.
So I spent a long time on that this year, trying to really hone in on what I thought would be more accurate. And this is what I've come up with. You know, people can use that data to run whatever data they want. It's public data. This is what I feel is most accurate from a statistical standpoint.
Great.
Doug,
Thank
if I
you.
can add, the one concern I've often had with with the Census Bureau in general was the New York metro area.
Right, it's big.
It's big.
It's
I
not
mean,
the city.
It's 20 million people,
Right.
and there's only 8-point change that
Exactly,
live
it's
in the
about
city.
like a
So,
third of, or close to
yeah.
40% is
So
only New
I
York.
do think New York metro is not as helpful in this scenario.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have another question regarding the data. I wonder if we can get more information, not sure if it's possible, about, I see that the number of homeless people increased by 8%. So I wonder if we can get more information about how many of those, how many of those became homeless right after living in a rent-stabilized apartment. I also think it's very important to include more information about what are the incomes of the people who are currently receiving public assistance. Since public assistance recipients increased by 14%, yet employment supposedly increased, but people are in need, more in need than before. So what are the incomes of those people in public assistance who currently live in rent-stabilized apartment? Also, you mentioned Section A as one of the subsidies that were calculated in a certain population. So I also want to know what other subsidies were used or were used in the data apart from Section A. 'Cause
I'll try to take them as I'm remembering them. A lot of the data sources that we have, it's not our data. I'm getting it from the agencies who administer these programs. So in that sense, we're not going to be able to have a lot more specific data. It's possible in terms of public assistance that once the housing and vacancy survey is released, which it hasn't been yet, all the data that I'm reporting from the housing and vacancy survey was not calculated by me. It's not public data yet. That's something that could come out of there. But the actual statistics, presumably, you know, HRA knows the incomes of the people who applied for who get public assistance because they had to apply for it. Is that it's not public data? Is it foilable? I don't know. In terms of Department of Homeless Services, quite a few years ago, I don't remember the year, but I will try to find out. They did do, so they don't ask people coming into the shelters what type of apartment they had been in. They do ask for the address. And some number of years ago, somebody painstakingly went through the process of matching those addresses to rent-stabilized buildings. And again, you can't tell if it's a rent-stabilized apartment, but just if it was a rent-stabilized building. I can find that data for you. It's older. I can pass on that data, but it's not anywhere near current. It's probably at least 6, 7, 8 years old.
Got it. I wonder, thank you. I think it's important for future reports to include that data in this, because we need to know how many people living in rent-stabilized apartments are actually becoming homeless and or receiving public assistance, and what type of assistance are they receiving. I also think it is hard to, talk about employment and unemployment without also seeing data about the incomes for those new employments, right? Like we see a rise, I forgot what page is it? We see a rise in employment, but what are the industries exactly, and what are the wages that these people are actually getting paid? And in which districts are they living? I think it's
Okay,
good to.
so again, there's limitations to the data. I just want to make it clear because of some of the discussion that happened earlier. If I had the data, I would provide it. It's not something that's being done deliberately. It's just not available. The employment data by industry, there's a very comprehensive appendix that you can look at. No, you can't tell the exact wage of somebody that got hired. You know, within a specific industry, there's a range of wages. But you can look at the appendix and see exactly which sectors had increases or decreases and how much. And then there's separate indices for wages, and you can see how much wages in different industries went up. So a lot of that information is there, just not in the way, it's not possible to do it in the way that you're asking
And
for
Danielle,
it.
let me ask a follow-up question on that. I know we don't have wage change broken down by, say, income quartile. I know that data isn't available, and I know the best we can do on that is to look at industry proxies. Is there any way, sort of as Akina was asking, to get a sense of, in a more granular way, rent-stabilized tenants, so that we can do a little bit more of a match on that data to, because if you look across the industries, right, you know, you have data on, you know, for food service workers versus finance, and it paints a very different picture. And so if we're trying to unpack that 2.1% decline in real wages, I would love your thoughts on how we can better match that to the folks who are living in rent-stabilized housing.
I'm not sure there is going to be a great way. We don't have data on what industries people are working in. I have for many years, which is in the report, done this separate analysis where I take out the finance and insurance sector, which is not to say that rent-stabilized tenants don't work in that sector.
Sure.
It's just to say, and by the way, this from that survey, a sector means it's the sector of the employer. So somebody working at Goldman Sachs, if you work in the cafeteria or you're the president of Goldman Sachs, you all work in the finance and insurance sector. But I thought it was important to do a separate analysis where I take that out because not so much this year, but in many years, you can find that industry pulling much higher or much lower, especially because it includes bonuses. So it's not just strictly a wage, it's a wage plus a bonus. So if there's a good year on Wall Street, you get a big bonus. If there's a bad year, you don't, and it has a big effect normally, but not so much this year on what happens. But beyond that, I don't know what I could more broadly say.
Thank you.
I actually have a question also about the subsidies in a different way, but first I did want to just state that back to the affordability discussion in terms of what should be permissible to be reviewed as this board. There was litigation about this in 2017. There was actually a case, Rent Stabilization Association versus the Guidelines Board, and it was found that affordability can be discussed in the ways that we see fit as a board, right? So just in terms of going back to a more granular look at what's affordable for folks who are getting rent adjustments. My question about the subsidies was in the context of gross rent to income ratios. So they pulled out, like there was that stat about 32%
Yes.
excluding. I'm just wondering what subsidies were excluded, and I guess in the HVS or HPD can maybe answer a question that I would have after that, which would be what the actual contract rents would look like and the subsidy amounts for some of those buildings. But first I'd like to hear what subsidies were excluded.
So I didn't run the data myself. I don't have access to the data yet. So I can ask HPD exactly what they excluded. But I can't answer that right now. And at this point, any other data that you would need from the HVS would have to go through HPD, and it's going to take some time. Yeah.
So I guess to that end also, are we expecting that HPD, when they present next week, they can provide us with at least a snapshot of sort of the 2022 picture? Yeah, I mean, since the last HVS.
I don't believe that they can do that, because that's, that, I will say this, that they're conducting, starting in the spring, the next HVS. It's a 2-year between. And that's supplementing the ACS data. That's one reason why we did that, because that's wages from data from 2021, which unfortunately some of the HVS data is 2022, especially, 2020, which is especially when it comes to wages. But I don't think do you know if they simulated? I don't think they
I
take a
highly
stab.
doubt it. I don't know what they would use to,
Yeah, it's something
Yeah.
we can certainly, when they're here, we can ask them
Right.
if there's some metric that they use to try to figure that out.
Okay. Because I'll ask it as well next week, but something I looked at in the previous year's HVS was household composition and characteristics, because again, this idea of median income, right, for, or being at 47,000, it doesn't really speak to how many people are in the household. And, what they did have from the HVS from last year, from 2021, just says like one adult, 27%, plus one child or single person. So again, getting more clarity on that makes a difference. And I guess
We can certainly circulate the selected findings
that would be great.
they sent. We did last year, but we'll do it again.
Sure.
And Don, on that, I would just say, I think these are great questions. It would be helpful to give them in advance, if they at least, if the answer is we don't have the data, the answer is we don't have the data. But
Yeah,
if they
I'll
do,
send them to
Sure,
HPD,
it'd be
send them to
great.
me, and I'll forward
Yeah,
them.
no,
At least
definitely.
Facilitate the
I can't
conversation.
imagine they have the data, but they'll be able to have answers.
Yeah.
Why?
If you could just also remind me, Andrew, because I know with HCR, sometimes we pose these questions in advance or something like that. I actually was not able to attend the portion of the HPD section last year. Is there a similar process, or is it?
We don't give generally HPD. Usually they come, on an HVS year, the big thing, they come and they report on the HVS. That's a big thing. Then they report on other programs that they do, anywhere from what's going on with violations. They're in REM stock, but they also talk to the loan side of what they provide for owners as well. So they talk about those programs. I believe they talk, I don't know if they talk about it, but we report their Section 8 part of what they do at HPD. So there's certain things they report on, and then often, during that session, we ask questions, and then they try to get back to whatever the topic is. But if you want, I can certainly forward questions to them prior to. HCR, we always fold questions prior to, but the idea is they're running all this data for us, hopefully we should have HCR in May.
Okay.
With all that. But, and I circulated questions. Any additional questions you want, bring them on down, and I will send them over.
There will be some.
And Genesis, I would say the same for you as well. If you have other questions or anyone else, it's good for them to have a little time to prepare.
Were you going to ask? I just had one
No,
other
no,
question
please, of
about
course.
the data. So I did have a question about, again, the gross median income and things like that. First, I just want to make a note, right, that 30%, anything above 30% is rent burden. We all can agree on that, and that there wasn't a single situation in this entire report that showed gross to income ratios less than rent burdened, right? So starting from a baseline with all the data that's been presented,
Yeah.
we're talking about New Yorkers being rent burdened. It's just a matter of how rent burdened they are. And you wind up seeing that overwhelmingly, folks in rent-stabilized housing are severely rent burdened and rent burdened. But my question for you, Danielle, was we talk about the median gross to rent income ratio at 34.3, right, for 2021. If we know that the 30% is the threshold for rent burden, can we get data on the number of rent-stabilized households that just above 30% are just burden? It's there? Because I thought I missed it. I must have missed it, I suppose.
Give me 1 second. Sorry, give me 1 second to find it to you. So in page 12, in the first column,
Page 12.
we say that 39.5% of rent-stabilized households pay more than This is 50%. I have the 30%. If you want it at 30%, I can do it at 30%.
Yeah, I was just wondering
Yeah.
because, you know, that, to me, that matters because,
Yeah.
you know, where's that 4% going? Like all those folks,
Yeah, that's right.
it'd be important to have that accounted for.
Yeah, I do have those numbers for 30%, so I can
That would be-
duplicate this for, yeah.
That would be helpful, thank you. And I guess the last thing that I will just make note of in terms of just evictions, and I would be remiss if I didn't bring it up as a housing attorney. According to the ANHD, the Housing Data Coalition, and the Right to Counsel Coalition, since January of 2022, there have been 17,000 represented evictions and 19,000 evictions where folks were represented by counsel. I'm sorry, I had it backwards. 19,000 tenants were evicted that were not represented, and 17 with representation. I bring this up because, A, as we've talked about before, evictions are skyrocketing by the numbers, right? But also, there is a severe stress on providers, and that is something that needs to be taken into consideration. I mean, we saw that with right to counsel law and its implementation, you wound up having folks who are able to stay in their homes simply because they've gotten legal counsel. And that those percentages are pretty high. I don't recall them off the top of my head, but I want to say the ability to keep someone in their home was like 90% of the time when they had a lawyer as opposed to otherwise. So if we're seeing that the court is continuing to calendar these cases and proceed with these cases, and you're seeing providers who are suffering from massive attrition, super high caseloads, people turning different cases away that are getting referred to them through the court, through HRA, you're going to wind up seeing those eviction numbers continue to increase for various reasons, including the fact that there's just not enough providers to deal with that level of cases.
So I have a question. The 17,000 evictions where there was an attorney. Are we talking about non-payment cases? Only because I'm struggling to understand how a represented tenant having a lawyer keeps them in the apartment unless they get a one-shot, right? If it's a non-payment proceeding, the only thing that's keeping the tenant in the apartment is payment. So,
I mean, we don't have to get into the specifics of housing practice, but I just don't necessarily think that's true, right? Like we see oftentimes, sometimes people aren't getting served properly. People don't know what arguments to make. People don't know because they might not have the accessibility to different programs or charities or whatever it may be. And so you're making a lot of assumptions as to, someone's ability to just navigate the system when the system is, in my opinion, stacked initially against them, right? So I just think that if we're going to be making assumptions on both sides, it might not do us a lot of good in that arena, whereas I can point to, these are the number of folks who wound up getting evicted who had lawyers, and these are the number of folks who got evicted and didn't have lawyers. That's the point I'm making.
I understood the point. I'm just trying to understand how a lawyer helps someone who doesn't come up with the money. The lawyer is, right?
I guess it sounds like there are reports underlying this, and maybe if you could share them with the board, that would be great, and we can have a look at that. Thank you, Adon. Yeah.
But we do talk a bit about the fourth quarter of last year about representation on page 25. So we do have numbers about that. It's not from the first year going forward, but it talks about in the fourth quarter, 63%. What was it? 78% of households facing eviction in housing court who had counsel were able to avoid eviction, and then we break it down by each borough. So that's some numbers about if you're represented by counsel and what that means. So we included what we had, but we could try to find stuff since January 1.
I just want to make one last comment.
Please.
As practitioners, and we can move off this, but as landlords, attorneys, we love when tenants have attorneys. Our wish is that everyone is represented because the alacrity with which the cases move is 10x. They typically move quicker. I mean, unless there's frivolous defenses that don't have any basis in reality, then yes, they get tied up. But generally speaking, tenants with lawyers have, it's much more level playing field, and we appreciate it.
Thank you. Genesis, Christina, Doug, any other comments or questions for Danielle? Genesis, please.
Yeah, I think it's important also to note that about 1 or less than 1% of the new, of people who are in the homeless shelter are made up by the new migrants. And I wonder if we can get specific numbers for that, to account for this.
So I don't have direct access to those numbers, but there was a report that came out from the comptroller's office just a few days ago. I think they got the data directly from the mayor's office, and it does show you exactly, since starting in September, which is when they started tracking that, it does show you exactly how many of the people in the homeless shelters were the migrants and otherwise. So if you want that data from the comptroller, I'm happy to pass that on.
That'd be great. I think if you could share that with the board, I think that'd be helpful. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Genesis. Please, no.
I swear it's my last one on this.
okay.
But it's actually not on this necessarily. It was just an ask that I wanted to get out to the RGB entity. Because we talked a bit about it last week in terms of commercial tenancies. And I was thinking in the interim, is there a way that we can get more data about the commercial vacancies by borough for rent stabilized buildings to see, and also to see like the median or average rent that they were paying? Is that possible to get?
I mean, I know last week when we looked at income and expenses, we were able to break out both geographically and by building, commercial versus 100% or 80% rent stabilized.
Respond to vacancy.
Yeah.
We'd have to look into it, not from the data set that's in that report. So that's all I can say. So I don't know whether there's some other group tracking that. I mean, we'll look. We'll see.
Good. Chris, okay. Obviously, we'll have more time to talk about all of this, and I think it's good to put our data questions on the table. Danielle, thank you again for putting all of this, and thank you in advance for the follow-up questions we've gotten, and let's come back to that next week.
A 2-minute break. And then Michael,
Yeah, do folks need a quick break before we have our guest speaker? Okay, let's take 5 minutes, and then we will come back at 11:10, and Michael will welcome you. Thank you. All right, Michael, I think we're going to get started. Brian, are we ready to go? Yes. Okay, great. So welcome back. Today's guest speaker is Michael Edelman, president of M&T Realty Capital Corporation. Michael has been in the lending arena for over 25 years and is responsible for external customer and capital relationships, including relationships with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And prior to joining, and correct me if I'm getting any of this wrong, prior to joining M&T, Michael held various roles at Freddie Mac here in New York and ultimately served as vice president managing Freddie Mac's Northeast region. In that role, he was responsible for lender development, managing a staff of over 25, overseeing a loan portfolio of over 30 billion and annual origination volume of approximately 5 billion, including mixed-use property, senior housing, co-ops, light tech, and bond credit enhancements. Michael, thank you for joining us. I think it's helpful to get your perspective. We're going to be examining, as I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting before you arrived, our mortgage survey next week, and then we'll hear from others on the 27th. But I think it's very helpful to get your perspective from within the industry on what you're seeing. So let me hand it over to you, and again, thank you for being here.
Better? Okay. Just to piggyback a little bit on the introduction, just by way of context, which is relevant to when I talk about the banking market and what we do is M&T Realty Capital Corporation is a subsidiary of M&T Bank. We're the 11th largest bank in the country. We're based here in Midtown Manhattan, and we're a very active construction and permanent loan lender here in the 5 boroughs. The group that I run specifically does one unique thing, and it goes back to my background at Freddie Mac, is we actually take loans that we originate and we sell them off to Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae and FHA. And what that does is again, important to this conversation, is it alleviates it takes the asset off of our books and eliminates the risk that we own that asset with, and it generates a fee revenue. So it's a net win for a banking institution to sort of monetize the fees that they will get from a loan and eliminate the risk of the potential of default and refinance risk and various risks associated with it. So that brings me to sort of just talking a little bit about the banking industry in real estate lending, specifically in the 5 boroughs. And obviously, you know, a lot of press, a lot of news about bank failures, and you know, runs on banks is the terminology. Really, you know, from my personal opinion and our analysis is that you know, banks have really a balance sheet. They have assets and liabilities. The assets are the commercial loans that they make, and the liabilities are the deposits that they take in. They take deposits in, that's a liability to the depositor, and they fund that out as an asset and take loans in, and that's an asset. What typically occurs is the liabilities are short-term. People deposit money and they could take it out tomorrow and bring it somewhere else if they get a higher rate. And the assets tend to be longer term, and they're, you know, we lend anywhere from 5 to 30-year mortgages. And the issue becomes when the liabilities reprice quicker, and we've seen people with savings deposits go from essentially 0 to, you know, 2, 3, 4% over the last probably 6 months. And the liabilities have not repriced. So people who have 3% mortgages are less apt to repay those mortgages to go into a 5 and 6% mortgage. So when you have that sort of mismatch, and you know, you exacerbate that by people pulling assets out of banks, you have less money to fund new assets, less deposits to fund new assets. It creates this mismatch, and we call it an asset liability mismatch. And ultimately that led to a couple of banks really, you know, having a run on the bank. It gets exacerbated in social media. People say this bank's going to fail, and then, you know, it used to be people would line up at banks to get their money out. Now you just get your smartphone out and you hit transfer, and the money's out instantaneously. So, so that's a little bit of the background vis-a-vis a Signature and Silicon Valley Bank. You know, I'm obviously putting it in simplistic terms from a real estate lending perspective. So it goes to the point that I mentioned before, that we take these assets and we sell them and monetize them, and we get fresh liquidity. It gives us the ability to lend more. The other thing that's happened in the New York City real estate lending environment is what I mentioned before about interest rates have gone up pretty significantly. We use it in terms of basis points, and basis points is, it's 100 basis points and 1%. So it's gone up between 150 and 200 basis points, so 1.5% to 2%. So when we look at new loans that come in the door, we size those loans up. We estimate how much we could lend based on what the current rate is. So if someone did a loan 2 years ago at a 3% rate, they got significantly more money than they'll get today at a 5 and a 5.25% rate, which is more or less where we're lending now. So, so what's really happened is that rate environment has changed. So existing loans that are on the books are less apt to pay off, and new loans that we make are at a higher rate, and those loans are reduced. So there's been a significant decrease in the lending that we could do on commercial real estate loans, multifamily mortgages, because of the increase in rate. So that's happened. So you exacerbate that by there's concerns that depositors have with money in certain banks, and there's been a flight to these what we call money center banks, the too big to fail institutions, the Bank of Americas, the Chases, the larger banks. And so we've seen a drain in deposits. So deposits have come down, decreasing our liquidity to lend more. Rates have gone up, and so people are less apt to pay off existing mortgages. That's another decrease. And in order to sort of service our clients and fund loans, we're putting term sheets out there. Our hit rate on those term sheets has gone up with the decrease of a Signature Bank and other lenders getting a little more conservative. So, really those three things, payoffs being down, deposits being reduced, and our hit rate on term sheets that we put out there have really caused a stress on the balance sheet. And it has created a situation where, and we're not alone in this, that the lenders are a little less apt to be aggressive in their lending, especially, exacerbated by higher rates, so the loan sizings are down. So I said a lot there to sum up the whole banking industry in a nanosecond, but that's really what we've been experiencing. The other thing that we do, we have a $40 billion servicing portfolio. When I say servicing portfolio, we have $40 billion in loans on multifamily assets. And every year we get a rent roll and an income and expense report on those assets. And we require that 90 days after the end of the year, which we're just getting those in now. We sort of do our analytics, and we look from year to year to see how our properties that we're lending on are performing. That's a precursor to say if there's some stress or some problems on a specific loan or property, we want to examine it further and potentially set aside reserves, contact the borrower, see, what's the story, if there's a short-term blip or if it's a longer-term trend that we need to be concerned about. So I pulled some of those analytics, and again, we're sort of just getting through those numbers, and I obviously, sorted it by just the New York City portfolio. And what we've seen over the last year on the data that we have, again, it's not perfect data, is we've seen an increase in our expenses by 4%. So we would take 2021 data of income and expenses and compare it to 2022. So expenses are up 4%, our rents are up 2%, and we look at rents kind of in two ways. It's rent collected, not rent charged. So we're looking at actual collections. We use the term, instead of saying the rents are up, we say the collections are up. So mixed into that is potentially changes in vacancy, changes in people who are paying versus non-paying. And I think anecdotally, the feeling is that there's a lot more people who are less so in arrears now and are paying, and the vacancy has gone down. But that being said, so you take the income, we're up 2%. You take the expenses, we're up 4%. Income minus expenses is a terminology we call NOI, net operating income of a property. That's the number that we use that's available to pay debt service. That number is down, and we're down basically 2% on that. So it's 2% increase in rents, 4% increase in expenses. Interestingly enough, real estate taxes were a bigger part of that. We thought we would show a downward trend on real estate taxes, but that's actually gone up 2%. And, you know, we also slice and dice it on the real estate taxes per unit. It's up $200 per unit. So bottom line, a lot of numbers I'm throwing out there, but our net operating income has decreased by 2% year over year, 2021 versus 2022, or at least the data we have so far on 2022. So with an NOI decrease and rates up from the low 3% range to the low 5% range, almost 150 to 200 basis points, there's a lot of concern that a lot of these loans are going to have trouble refinancing. The loan proceeds alone with a 150 to 200 basis point increase in underwriting rates, that's a 30% decrease in what we could lend on that asset had we had it today versus done it a year ago at a lower rate. So again, a lot of numbers. I'll pause there and open it up, and happy to answer any questions.
Michael, can I ask you about the profile of your portfolio, how it looks in terms of the type of units, location, not in detail, but, and how it sort of reflects the work here around rent stable? Like, do you know the percentage of your portfolio that's rent stabilized?
So similar to the other speaker before, we know buildings that have been rent regulated. Right. We don't have exact numbers. We do at origination of, we'll take a rent roll and we'll slice and dice every unit, and we'll look at market units and rent stabilized units. On an ongoing basis, we don't monitor that. The numbers that I've mentioned is, I took the whole portfolio. We've eliminated situations where we lend on underlying co-ops. We took those out. We lend on student housing. We took that out. And the numbers that I referenced are rent stabilized buildings in the 5 boroughs, essentially.
Genesis, please.
Yeah, I wonder what percentage of those loans are new, let's say from 2020 to now, 2023?
So anything that these loans are pre-2022. I'm sorry, pre-2021, because I took the analysis and said, let's look at the same buildings from 2021 data and 2022, and we compared side to side. So we tried to create apples to apples comparison. Anything that was originated subsequent to 2021 was not included in those numbers.
Got it. And then you mentioned that more people are paying the rent compared to what year?
So between the 2 years, 2021 and 2022, we've seen the income side of it grow 2%. It's a function of really 3 factors: the vacancy, the rents being charged, and the collections. We don't delineate between those 3 categories, unfortunately, but just in talking to owners, the trend seems to be, it's more anecdotal, that the non-payment has been reduced. And it's a small sample size. I've just, some clients that we deal with who own substantial portfolios of rent-stabilized buildings have said that collections are better this past year versus 2021, which was right in the middle of COVID and all the eviction issues were going on with respect to courts. So the payment in their mind, the payment collection numbers have increased. There's less non-payers.
Christina.
I had a question. I was reading a news article recently about Signature Bank, and because it's so key to the New York City real estate market, because it knows the market so well. This is more a question about underwriting, and it mentioned the HSTPA and underwriting and how national banks with their appraisals were, because of HSTPA, were slashing appraised values by up to 30% on a building. And I was wondering if that's something that in your underwriting you had come across. I understand M&T is actually like a local New York bank that probably understands the impacts better than like a lender from Kansas City might understand it, but if you could talk a little bit about that underwriting.
Sure. I think I'm going to answer your question, but if not, then direct me in the right direction. So there's various ways that we underwrite loans. An appraisal is what we like to say is one tool in the tool shed. So when you get an appraised value, especially if you get it from a national firm out of Kansas City, I think you mentioned, what they do let me back up a second. The net operating income of a building is the first number you take, and then you divide that by a capitalization rate. The capitalization rate is a function of the return to an investor. That's probably 25% of that number. 75% is the return to the debt investor, which are rates. Those rates have gone up anywhere from 1.5% to 2%. So the appraisers, what they do is that's called the band of investment. They determine that's the mathematical solution to a cap rate. What the reality is, what they do is that they take actual sales of buildings back into an NOI, have a sale price because it's recorded, and they back into a cap rate. So they use that capitalization rate, apply that to the net operating income of the subject property to determine value. The problem with that analysis is that's a backwards-looking analysis on actual sales. And so for a period of time, probably up until, I would say the majority of 2022, we really did not see a significant amount of sales. And there was a lot of disconnect where an owner thought that their value was what it was in the past at 3% rates, and the buyer says, well, the value is based on 5% rates. So there was a pretty significant disconnect, and the investment sales market for multifamily buildings was significantly down. So when you look at an appraisal and they're taking historic sales and they have to sort of match up, the right size of the building, the right location of the building, the right profile of the rent stabilization versus market mix, they look to find the best investment sale comp or comparable, and that was a difficult thing. So I'm not surprised that people were discounting it by 30%, because 30%, ironically, is the amount of debt that will be reduced with a 200 basis point increase in rate.
So it sounds like, though, the appraisal is being discounted more because of historic sale prices and the change now in interest rates. It might not necessarily be because of changes in legislation is that sort of inaccurate?
When you say changes in legislation?
Well, so I'm saying the article itself that I was reading was talking about the New York City commercial or real estate lending. There are banks that know the market really well because they're here and they understand HSTPA, different legislation, and how that can impact the value of a building. Whereas a bank, if you're looking at a lender who's doing it all from their windshield, sort of, from far away, might not necessarily understand it. And the concern was that with sort of the one less lender in the market, that essentially underwriting was going to get more challenging, and therefore values of buildings were falling. But it sounds, that's sort of an oversimplification. It sounds like to me.
Yeah, that could be correct and anecdotal, but I think the math associated with the rate increases probably has more of an effect on it. Right. But they both jive together. I mean, both could be true.
Okay, and then you also mentioned cap rates are rising right now.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Which is another.
Yeah.
Let me just add a sort of clarifying question on top of that, because I think it's a really important point. So as you think about underwriting, you're looking ahead, say, at a 10-year window, you're underwriting to, I assume, to some projection of income, of rents and expenses over time. And I guess one variation on Christina's question is, have your underwriting standards changed significantly post-2019? Or are you still projecting in sort of the same general range? Because that's part of the conversation that I think we're having. Yeah.
So, again, multiple tools when you make a credit decision on an asset, and obviously appraisal, as I mentioned, is one of them. We look at what the current cost of the debt is and what the debts, we call it a debt service. So every month, the borrower has to pay interest and principal back. So we test that against the income of the property. So we look at, NOI again, income minus expenses, what's available to pay debt service. We test that against what the debt service is, and obviously now that amount of debt service is going to be, or the amount that you could pay is going to be, calculated at a higher rate. So the amount of the loan goes down. So that's what we look up front. We also have another tool, which we call a refinance rate, or refinance test, essentially. So we take the income and expenses, we extrapolate that out over the life of the loan, and one of the most important things from a lender is you want to get paid back at maturity. It's great that you get paid monthly interest. Ultimately, you want to get paid back because these are all balloon mortgages, right? So we amortize that mortgage down over the life of the loan. We test with a hypothetical rate, and we'll stress interest rates by probably 200 basis points going out to the maturity, depending on the term of the maturity. And we grow income and expenses, and that's the tricky thing. So what a lot of banks do and what we do is we look at historical trends in income and expenses. And historically, our New York City portfolio has had basically an income growth of 2% and an expense growth of 3%. So we'll take those 2 and 3%, we'll grow the income at 2, expenses at 3. We'll take what the principal balance will be at maturity, we'll apply a higher rate to that, and we want to make sure that we can get paid off by that borrower refinancing at maturity. So, so historically, it's been 2 and 3. That's the numbers that we continue to use. I think in the first couple of years, we looked to the Rent Guidelines Board increases. We'll apply that for year 1 and year 2. Obviously, we don't know beyond that. So 2 is typically the number that is applied to that, so.
I can ask. Yeah, I can ask something else. I wonder how many of these multifamily buildings are also receiving subsidies from like HUD, or not subsidies, but like loans. Or,
Section 8?
yeah, well, yeah, some not. I mean, HUD has different type of ways of subsidizing, but I wonder if they are getting loans specifically from HUD.
Sure, so
What percentage?
back to my role at the bank, and I mentioned Freddie and Fannie, we really distribute loans to multiple investors in mortgages. Number 1 is Freddie, number 2 is Fannie, number 3 is HUD. So we do FHA insured mortgages. So our portfolio, our origination over the last couple of years, we did about $1.8 billion of HUD mortgages in 2021, and last year we did about $600 million of HUD insured mortgages in 2022. So again, it's a function of rates being significantly higher, that there's less opportunities. People who have low coupons are not going to refinance. So the market's changed. It's a much more difficult environment to make transactions work and to incentivize owners to refinance, because in a HUD mortgage, we'll originate the mortgage and we'll sell it to the FHA, and they wrap it and sell it as a security. So so as a percentage of our overall portfolio, I think HUD insured mortgages are probably in the 20% range, but that 20% probably has remained constant, but our overall volumes have gone down pretty significantly in the
And
last year.
that 20% are those buildings, is a 20%, are those building project-based Section A?
So mostly, I would say.
Okay, so
I would say-
they're not rent stabilized then?
Well, you could have Section 8 and rent stabilized too. So there are some that have that. I don't know the exact number that breaks out, but I would say they're primarily subsidized loans.
Yeah, like if they're receiving the HUD loans, then they're not rent stabilized. So I wonder what percentage specifically of those loans are for rent stabilized units?
I would say on the HUD mortgages, it tends to be a much smaller number. I would say it's probably 5 or 10%. So the HUD mortgages take a very long period of time to originate, potentially over a year in some cases. They do new construction. There's a whole multiple different programs. When it comes to a stabilized property, it's not a big, just because it's a function of the market in New York City, there's a lot more lenders that could close significantly quicker. And the owners tend not to be as patient as they are in, other parts of the country. So we don't do a lot of that type of business here.
Great. Thank you. Doug?
Thank you, Michael. This is actually really interesting, sort of on the ground, excuse me, real-time data. So I think I heard you say that NOI from your portfolio was down about 2%, 21 to 22.
Correct.
What does that look like for the prior 2 years before that? Like, is that trend, or if you go back a few years, how that looks?
I don't think I have that number, but I would say that over the last number of years, we've seen some NOI deterioration overall. I think it's a function of specifically last year, but also over the last 3 to 4 years.
Well, that's what I was, trying to
Wage
understand
increases.
better.
Real estate, what we see, so we'll slice and dice it based on the different components of it. And the 3 biggest components of expense growth, which has caused our NOI to deteriorate, are and maybe not in this specific order, but real estate taxes, insurance is a killer these days. We've seen insurance bills more or less double in certain situations, especially something in the Rockaways or near any, in a.
Any flood zone.
In a flood zone, exactly. We lend in Gowanus as well, and we've seen it there too. So it's really real estate taxes to a certain extent, insurance to a certain extent, and then wages. Salaried employees, especially if it's a union building. So, and we lend to both union and non-union
And
properties.
are you able to measure arrears in your stock, like, or non-performing loans? I mean, or what that looks like, even sort of
So,
globally?
if I'm not understanding correctly, let me know. Arrears on property collections or arrears in our loans?
No arrears in your loans.
So we have, on the multifamily portfolio, we've had 2 loans that have gone, there's different classifications of arrears. Once it goes beyond 90 days, it's what's called a criticized asset. We have to set aside reserves. So over the last, I would say, 2.5, 3 years, we've had 2 loans go to 90-day delinquencies. And it was a function of collections mostly on those properties, probably last year. The multifamily rent stabilized portfolio is about $4 billion. So I would say those 2 loans, in terms of numbers of loans, it's probably 2 out of 100, so maybe 2% that have gone 90 days. And both have been made current. Actually, one refinanced out, which we were very happy for that. The other one, they made current, and it's current, but we monitor it on a monthly basis. So I would say 2% of our loans over the last 3-4 years of that size portfolio.
And are you seeing any more recent data on that? I mean, that's a pretty striking figure about the health of the portfolio as a whole. Are you seeing any trend lines more recently, or is that sort of holding steady?
That's held steady in terms of non-payers on loans. I think the larger trend is what we call refinance risk. So a lot of loans that have been made over the last 3, 4, 5 years at significantly low coupon rates. When I mentioned we did that sort of test where we'll grow the income and expenses grow higher, faster than the income, and we tease that NOI based on where rates are theoretically at that point. I think the reality is we're at that point, right? Rates have gone up 200 basis points. So, we're trying to incentivize. A lot of these loans there's a prepayment penalty. So we've reached out to loans that are coming up for prepayment, and we try to incentivize the borrowers to prepay early, essentially, because we are concerned that we'll be able to get refinanced out. So that's kind of more so than the operations of the property. It's being able to pay off their existing mortgages.
So just wanted to follow up then on Adon. So obviously we're very early into the year in which, last year obviously the board authorized 3.25. So you probably aren't seeing much movement on the income side, but would you expect as that gets metabolized into, I mean, obviously there are 1-year rents, 2-year rents.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen immediately, but if you're underwriting at a 2% rent growth, are you beginning to see any of that increase already, or what's the kind of lag time before you would see that in your portfolio?
I would probably say, because it just took effect towards the end of last year, so you have to wait till those units
Starts October 1, right?
renew, essentially, and then you get sort of backwards-looking data of that income come in. So I would say you're probably going to see that. Again, the income is up 2%, which again is a function of probably some of the rents, but more so on the collections. And I think we'll see that probably next year.
Okay, thank you.
The real impact.
Thank you.
First, thank you for the presentation. It was informative. I just had a question. Do we have the numbers of rent-stabilized properties that have refinanced in 2021 within your portfolio?
In our portfolio, I do not know that, but I'm just thinking off the top of my head because all the New York City deals come across my desk. We didn't have a great year because rates were clicking up. I think the early part of the year was when there was a lot more activity, and the end of the year was very slow. I don't want to speculate on a number. We've done, it's more than 0 and less than 10% of our portfolio. I'll say that.
Gotcha.
So.
Follow-up question on refi. How long is the typical term on a refinance?
For the new loan that they go into?
Yeah, so say a multifamily owner wants to refinance, this would probably be more likely under a 2.5% rate.
Yeah.
Timeframes to say last year they refinanced. What's the typical term for a refinance loan?
So I think what we offer is anywhere from 5 to 30 years. The most typical refinance that people take are 7 and 10-year loans. That's the most popular product. And I think the delta between a 7 and a 10-year rate, people make their own sort of assessments. There's estate planning questions in there, so it's not always a true economic decision. It may be a estate planning or they're potentially going to sell the property in 5 years, so they'll do a 5-year loan. So a lot of that analysis is specific to the ownership structure. But it's usually 7 and 10-year loans.
And then it's a balloon payment at the end for the
Correct.
remaining value sort of the
Yeah,
loan.
the incentive for an owner is to never repay debt, because that debt, the
Right.
mortgage
So-
recording
so
tax.
typically they would hit year 6 in their 7-year term and then refinance again.
Exactly,
Right.
exactly, yeah.
I just want to make sure I'm understanding, but the concern now is somebody who refinanced last year at a 3%, now they're going to come in, well, I mean, hopefully in 7 years, we're not going to be at 5.5% or 6, but if that happens, then they're getting, that's where you're talking about sort of that concern of for the term you used about just refinancing being more
Refinance risk.
challenging.
It's really more so the people that refinanced 5 and 6 years ago
Right.
Okay,
on
right,
7-year
yeah.
terms. So if you did it last year, you have
Yeah,
a
you've
long
got time. So,
runway.
right, so they did it 5 years ago, it's coming up. Their rate that they have now is much lower than what they could get in today's market, and so
Correct.
that's the concern.
Correct. And again, simple math with a 150 to 200 basis point increase in rates, our loan that we'll lend is 30% less.
Less than what they
Yeah.
thought they would. Yeah.
And, again, owners tend not to want to refinance, to pay down debt over time. Their goal is to essentially increase the value of the building, increase the debt. So we do a lot of loans that don't even amortize. They're called interest only. So they're
Okay.
just paying interest only. So the notional amount of the debt is essentially the same. It's just your coupon's up pretty significantly
I
in
see.
your rate.
Okay, thank you.
That's the concern. And if the NOI doesn't increase to support paying that, then that's where that's what keeps us up at night,
Right.
mostly.
Okay, thank you.
Christina, please.
So it seems like there's a lot of downward pressure on these loans.
Yep.
We heard here already that 4 years consistent NOI down. Debt service is paid after NOI. So what are owners supposed to do in this instance, I guess, is one obvious question. It might be rhetorical, but how do they pay their loan if
Yep.
they're losing money every month?
It's a great question. So, the answer to that really spans the spectrum of the type of owners, right? So we really sort of, for ease of simplicity, we look at two type of owners. We look at the families, and there are some significant New York City families that have a long tenure of owning and developing in the city on rent-stabilized product that they have a reputation to uphold. So if they have to, essentially what we call, we use the term a cash-in refinance. If they have to refinance that loan and write a check to pay down the mortgage, we feel more comfortable with them being able to do that versus some more of what we call the institutional lenders, which are the funds and the equity funds that have raised equity, gone out and bought multifamily properties. And they have a responsibility to their investors to not write a check, and they can't go back to their investors for more equity. So that's where we're much more concerned. I think the families and the mom and pops realize that there's value in these buildings, even though their loan may be over leveraged, and they're going to write that check versus some of those investor funds that, there's going to be defaults. There will be, this issue, it's not relevant to this group, but is exacerbated even more so on the commercial, on office
Office.
buildings and hotels. That's where there's a real looming problem, and that sort of overlays that the multifamily market's done better, but it's still, the same problem exists. And I think the banks are concerned about their overall loan portfolio. multifamily finance is part of that, but overall, that's the issue. But I think the answer to your question is, we look for investors to essentially write that check, right? So come to the closing table for a refinance and writing a check, and no one wants to write that check, especially when they took that money years ago and reinvested that money. Some of them may not have it because they bought other buildings and they're in the same situation. I mean, that's the name of the game, is to refinance a building, take cash out, invest in another building, and grow your portfolio. And I think we've seen some people that just don't have the ability to write that check, and it becomes a problem.
Yeah, so I think the take money out often becomes put money back in, right?
Correct.
Because CapEx. I did want to also just quickly, Christina brought up HSTPA, so it's just basic math. HSTPA passed in 2019, and now we're seeing the third, fourth year of the effects of HSTPA. So often these mixed resi buildings, you had fair market units in with rent stabilized units. Those percentages are all over the place. Some are 75% stabilized, 25. The point being that the fair market units propped up the
Correct.
stabilized units. The under $1,400 units were propped up by the fair market units. HSTPA voided an owner's ability to use the fair market units to prop up the stabilized units, and it would seem to me that that river is here.
That's
it's,
correct.
It's here, and that could very well explain the fourth year consistent downward pressure on NOI.
Correct. And I would even go further, and we have, not every building has this, but a fair amount of buildings do have commercial components, ground floor retail. And you've seen a deterioration in occupancy and rents on ground floor retail, which further puts stress on some of these assets and the NOI.
Yeah.
But we extrapolate the commercial component from the multifamily component when we do our analysis on something like that. But you're right. I think the free market units have supported some of the rent stabilization rents.
Rob?
Yeah, just a follow-up. So this downward pressure, how is, as far as the maintenance of buildings, because I assume you go out, you're inspecting, the bank goes out, they take a look at it, they see what's going on. What is your sense as to the overall maintenance of buildings, of these multifamily buildings, based on this downward pressure?
So we do an inspection every year. We're required to go out, often unannounced, so we don't get someone painting the lobby when we're walking in the door. It's hard to give a overall assessment of the whole portfolio in that. I could say sort of more anecdotally that when there's stress on the NOI, the first thing that gets cut tends to be CapEx. And so if there's a major capital improvement project, and let me back up a second. When we do a loan on a building, we get an engineering report, and they assess all the capital needs over the life of that loan, plus 2 years. So if we do a 10-year loan, we get a 12-year assessment. There'll probably be, typically you see roofs, elevators, exterior facade work. And it's a lot easier for an owner to push that off. If we projected it should have been done in year 6 or 7, and we go out there and say, wait a minute, you were supposed to do this. This is on your engineering report. They'll say, well, that's our plan in next year or the year after. And, we're hopeful that that gets done, but I think a lot of times capital improvement is the first thing to get cut when there's stress on buildings.
Sorry, Andrew.
Just, you spoke to this last year, but of the revenue dollar that comes in, what is your expectation of debt service when you write these loans? How much of that dollar do you anticipate?
So typically, the two biggest components are real estate taxes, which are anywhere from, I'll say, 27 to 32% of income. Debt service is about 30% as well. So those are the two biggest components. And then you layer in all the other expenses of the building to get to that remaining income that we see derived. So it's usually about 30%, the debt service.
So not 30, is it 30% of the NOI or 30% of the whole dollar that you take in?
30% of the NOI, I'm sorry.
NOI,
Yes. Yeah, we look at it at NOI.
NOI.
Yeah,
okay.
we don't judge it.
Okay. And just another, so if you did a loan last year, 2 years from now, it's down 200 basis points. The willingness of the bank and the owner to want to then, let's look at this loan and refi, how does that impact you and the owner? Is it a good thing for everyone, or how does that work?
I think, so, we make money two ways, right? So net interest income, the cost of our capital versus what we receive back on a loan, and then fee revenue. So when you refinance a loan, there's more fee revenue. We charge an origination fee. So from an owner standpoint, and then also from a borrower standpoint, if rates are down, that's a positive to them. It gives them the opportunity to, again, lower rates, more debt that they could support from the building, gives them an opportunity to take some cash equity out. So I think lower rates in general are more positive to everyone, and we're experiencing the opposite of that right now.
Right, even if that loan has been originated a year ago.
Correct.
You look at it 3 years from now and you say, okay, we can do something, we'll refi now instead of the end of the loan.
Correct.
It's a win for both.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct, yeah. And we also charge a prepayment penalty in that example too, so it's exacerbated more of not just the origination fee on the new loan, but a prepayment penalty on the existing loan, if there is one, so.
Yeah, so earlier you mentioned that the rent collected is increasing, right? And historically, the expenses and income ratio has been 3:2, right?
That's, historically, it's been 3% expense growth, 2% income growth, correct?
Yeah, and this year is 2%.
2, and the expenses are up, income's up 2, and expenses are up 4.
Yeah, so therefore the NOI is 2%. And
Correct.
because more people are paying now, so would you say that that looks more positive to lenders? I know lenders are still conservative, but would you say that it's looking more positive for borrowers to pay back because of the increase of money being collected?
Yeah, so when we do an origination of a loan, we'll get what we call the historical collection. So we'll look over the previous 3 years and then current collections, and we want to see an upward trend of collections. Vacancy, non-payment, as well as the rent, the notional rent. So that's a positive trend. I think,
Exactly.
The concern more so now is not so much that the income is growing, it's the cost of financing, mortgage rates, essentially. But yes, that is a positive to your specific question. It's a
Okay,
positive.
so I think it would be good to say that there's a correlate. I mean, we can say that it will be, based on the rates that you are seeing, it will bounce back to the percentage that it was before, 2-3, not like it is now, 4-2.
Yes, the historical trend is 2 and 3,
Yes.
exactly.
So it's likely to go back based on what we're seeing. So I also wanted to point out that, I think Christina mentioned that the fair market units are propping up the rent stabilized units. I think it would be nice to get specific data of how many of those units that are in distress are actually in distress because of the commercial rent deficit. Because what I saw in the data presented before by Daniel is that there's a vacancy rate of 12.64 on units that are over 2,000, 2,300. And what we know, as a tenant, if you go to look for an apartment, you're not going to find, you are likely to find fair market rate apartment at a higher rate, meaning these numbers are up, about
Yeah.
$3,000, $4,000. The average rent right now in Manhattan is about $4,000. So there is very likely that the apartment at that rate is not rent stabilized. So I think it would be fair to say that, the rent stabilized units are actually the ones propping up the fair market units, because people cannot afford to live there, and therefore the vacancy rate is so high. And the stress is actually being caused by the loss in commercial rents. That's how I can look at this,
Yeah, another way, I think it's a great question, and maybe just to add on to it a little bit, do you have data that suggests if you disaggregate, say 100% rent-regulated buildings from buildings with, where you'd expect the NOI to have, or the income side to have 10% from commercial? Obviously, there's been a much steeper decline on the commercial side.
Correct.
And whether you're able to disaggregate that at all.
So we do extrapolate buildings with commercial, and we take out the commercial component. We sort of assign, obviously it's one property, one income and expense statement. We extrapolate the income and the expenses associated with that to create a better apples-to-apples comparison to 100% multifamily buildings. So we do that. With respect to just looking at 100% rent-regulated buildings versus not, I think we know, again, I mentioned it before, we know at origination, when we do the loan, what's 100% rent-regulated versus what's not. And, some of these loans date back, 7, 8, 9 years ago. I don't think we monitor the delta between rent-regulated and free market or deregulated rents from, 5, 6 years ago. So I could look in our portfolio to see what we thought was 100% rent-regulated and look just at those. I obviously don't have that data right in front of me, but it's something I could look at.
I just had another question. Back to the cash in and cash out refinancing. Do you have a sense of what percentage of the portfolio engages in which form of refinancing? The cash in or cash out amongst rent stabilized buildings?
So we only really look at that if we're coming up to maturity. We get a maturity report and we look 18 months out. So we'll do an analysis on properties that are maturing in the next 18 months, and we'll size those loans up. The majority of those loans can repay their existing debt. I think it's probably, it's probably 5 to 10% of those loans that there is that question of someone coming to the closing table to refinance it out. And those are the that I mentioned before. We'll incentivize a borrower to go refinance elsewhere, and we'll say, again, most of these loans have prepayment penalties. We'll say, we'll waive your prepayment penalty if you could refinance elsewhere. That hasn't been that successful because the issue that the analytics we're going to run are going to be the same with any other bank, give or take. But I would say it's probably 5 to 10% of the properties that we see that issue looming in the next probably 12 to 18 months, because we look out 18 months. We get the maturity reports. Most people don't wait till the end of their loan to refinance. So, there's really nothing that's maturing in 6 months. It's really from 18 to 12 months that we look at those loans.
Okay, so earlier you mentioned that small or families, right? Families that own buildings are likely to pay back the loan because they can write a check. And the ones that are usually less likely or have more risk are institutional, I forgot the word you use.
Institutional investors, yeah.
Investors, yeah. So, and those are likely to own multiple buildings, correct?
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
So would you say that the problem of paying back the loan can be solved by just selling another building? No?
It could be, yes, 100%.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. So that's a very easy way to solve the problem.
Yeah. Obviously, some people, those are, not to get into sort of that type of ownership, but, these are more advisors, and what they do and they get investors, and a lot of it is sometimes different pensions. They'll put money in, and these people operate on a fee revenue model where they go out and buy buildings and get paid each time they transact, and they manage that money for that investor. Sometimes they do sell buildings and they'll take a loss on one building, but they'll make money on another building, and they aggregate their returns. So they do look at it that way. My point on the family ownership is a lot of those sort of funds don't really have longevity. Well, I shouldn't say that. I think the family ownership model, from us as a lender, we look to the families and their reputation in this market, that they'll never want to default, so they'll be more apt to write a check than to default, because a lot of lenders may not want to touch them going forward, and they're, second, third, fourth generations.
Yeah, can I clarify, when you say New York families, you mean like the LaFracs and the.
Correct.
Those type, not the mom and pop who owns.
Correct.
Right, okay, I just wanted to clarify
Correct.
which families you were talking about.
Yeah. And, everyone, those are sought-after borrowers because people know they have a reputation of paying back. And some of these issues we talk about are less apropos to them.
Right.
But the institutional investors, there's more of a, it's math, it's not reputation. And so, while we're a little less aggressive and more cautious with those lenders, those are the ones that will probably see more of this issue when they come to refinance, so.
How many of those institutional investors would you say are or own like over-leveraged units?
It's a hard number to look at because we don't really look at the whole portfolio. And I mentioned only when deals come up for maturity do we size them up to see where we are. I would say that those tend to be the majority of them, if there are any deals that are over leveraged, without actually running the numbers, I would say, because they tend to, it's more of a financial modeling than a long-term ownership. So
Yeah.
their desire up front is to maximize the amount of debt they
Profits.
take on a property, and that stresses the property and potentially causes
Exactly.
problems.
So I guess we can also call them like predatory equity investors.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that word's been used.
Yeah.
We don't say that within the bank, but,
That's what they are, yeah. And these are buildings in which tenants are usually living in very bad conditions because they don't care about people's living standards. They just care about making a profit and reselling, right? Yeah.
Their model is a financial model, yes,
Exactly. So therefore, their debt is just irrelevant because they can just sell the building and solve the problem of the loan. I mean, that's how I see the whole picture.
Yep.
Thank you. Christina, thank you.
Well,
Christina, you had a
potentially, they can solve the problem of the loan unless they don't have the money to pay off the loan at the closing. I think also beggars can't really be choosers, because once we eliminate the institutional investor and the family-owned, the LaFracs, et cetera, there's not many other private housing providers left. So I think we need to sort of all get along, that our institutional owners and our family owners are all we have when it comes to multifamily housing.
I mean, I disagree. I think, I think our role here at the Rent Guideline Board is to make sure that tenants are being protected from the majority of these investors that are institutional owners that own multiple buildings and are predatory equity investors. That's our job. And there's many models of housing that doesn't need to be the current model that we have. And, I think it's important to say that owners of rent-stabilized units also get incentives, right? That can be invested in other type of housing if we want to go that route. I think, there's many other ways to house people.
I'll just say this from a perspective of being a lender nationwide. So we're agnostic to where we lend. Obviously, the deal stands on its own, and the borrower stands on its own. You tend to see less of those institutional investors in the New York City market, just because there's more regulation associated with it. So a lot of times they and there's been lessons learned, exactly to your point, over the last 5-7 years, and they're less apt to come and invest here. So while there are some legacy loans and some mom and pops families have sold to some of them and they've inherited some of our loans, from a lender's perspective, we tend to see that as a percentage of all our investors less so here than it is in other parts of the country.
Yeah, but they're still the majority here. Although they are less than in other states, they are still the majority in New York City, especially.
Yeah, that I don't know.
I'm sure,
Not
yeah.
in our portfolio, they're not the majority, but we tend to value those family ownerships versus the institutional investors. But we've lent to both, and there are other banks that I'm sure you're aware of that were a little more aggressive in doing those loans.
Yes.
There's a huge reputational risk where while we're the 11th largest bank, we're what we call a community bank, and so we're less apt to go after those type of investors, but that being said, we've had some.
Thank you.
Michael, thank you so much. It's incredibly generous of you to share your time.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for your questions. If there are no other items of business, I would seek a motion to adjourn. Thank you, Christina. We are adjourned. Oh, second, sorry. Thank you, Genesis. Can't forget that. Thank you. And thank you, Michael.